Hello and welcome to Mickeyology, where we take Disney movies a little bit too seriously. I'm Austin Wrathall. I recently posted a video about when and where Disney's Cinderella takes place. And today I thought it would be a good idea to compare how the animated and live-action versions of Disney's Cinderella compare to the two most famous literary versions of the story. So let's take a moment and see how Disney's Cinderella stacks up against the versions written by the Grimm brothers and Charles Perrault. Let's start with the basic structure. Both the Grimm and Perrault versions of Cinderella are very short stories. Disney, however, expanded the story for both their animated and live-action versions. So they give the characters more to do, they make the plot a little more complex in some areas, and they give some minor characters a much larger role in their version of the story. So there is a lot in both of the movies that does not exist in the written versions. Next, the characters. Every major character from the Perrault version of the story appears in both Disney versions of the story. In all three, we have Cinderella, we have her father, we have her stepmother, of course, her two stepsisters, the prince, her fairy godmother, and we have mice, rats, and lizards. Perrault also names one of the stepsisters. One of the stepsisters is called Charlotte, which is different from the Disney version of the stepsisters, who are named Anastasia and Drizella. The Grimm brothers' cast of characters for Cinderella is slightly different. We have no mice and we have no fairy godmother in this version. Instead, we have a magical tree and plenty of birds who aid Cinderella. The tree and the birds take the place of both the mice and the fairy godmother in this version of the story. What about the plot? Well, the Perrault version of Cinderella once again follows very closely with the version that Disney made, and it's very clear that Disney was pulling mostly from Perrault's version of Cinderella when they wrote their screenplays for the animated and live-action films. In all three versions of Cinderella, we have Cinderella's father remarrying, the stepmother and stepsisters move into the home and are cruel to Cinderella and give her the cruel nickname of Cinderella, or Cinderwench, as Perrault writes. Then the prince throws a ball. Cinderella is not allowed to attend with her family. Her fairy godmother then steps in and makes her a magic carriage out of a pumpkin and transforms mice, rats, and lizards into her drivers and footmen. Cinderella goes to the ball, dazzles everyone there, leaves behind a glass slipper as she hastens to depart before the enchantment wears off, and then the prince uses the glass slipper to track her down, which he does, and they live happily ever after. However, there are some differences between the written version and Disney's film versions. For example, in Perrault's story, Cinderella's father does not pass away, as he does in both of the Disney films. Instead, he continues to live with Cinderella and does the stepmother's bidding and does not stand up to her. Perrault also adds some more detail to the preparations for the ball. Cinderella does her stepsister's hair to help them get ready, and Perrault describes the types of dresses that the stepsisters will be wearing when they attend. Also in the written version, the ball lasts 2 nights instead of just 1. Cinderella leaves on time the first night, but not on time the second, which is why the prince has to chase her down with that glass slipper. Also, when the prince finds Cinderella and she tries on the slipper, she proves that not only does her foot fit that slipper, but she also has the second slipper in the set. She does this in the animated film as well. However, Disney writers gave her a bigger reason and motivation to produce the second slipper, because in the animated film, the first slipper ends up shattered before Cinderella can try it on. However, for the most part, the Perrault version is right in line with the Disney version, and both the live-action and animated films stay very, very faithful to Perrault's tale. The Grimm brothers version is quite different, and it is much darker than Perrault's. The Grimm version opens on the death of Cinderella's mother. After her mother dies, her father once again remarries, and at one point in the story, Cinderella asks her father, while he is traveling to a fair, to bring back a branch with him. The branch she plants in the garden, and it becomes a magical tree, a little white bird perches itself in the tree and begins to grant her wishes from time to time. Well, her father marries the stepmother, the mean stepsisters are cruel to her, and they drop peas and lentils into the ashes by the fireplace and force her to pick them up, thus contributing to her getting that cruel nickname of Cinderella. Then they get word that the prince is throwing not a ball, but a festival this time, and the festival is to last 3 days. Unlike in the Perrault story, Cinderella asks if she can attend the festival, and her mother says yes if she can pick up all the lentils scattered in that fireplace. With the help of her bird friends, Cinderella meets the challenge, but her stepmother goes back on her word. Cinderella goes to the tree, not a fairy godmother, and wishes for the things she needs for the ball, and the birds drop down golden shoes and a beautiful dress. Cinderella attends and dazzles and meets the prince, and she flees each night. At one point she hides in a pigeon coop and another time in a pear tree, and her father gets an axe because he suspects that she's hiding in those places and cuts those things down, but she always manages to flee. However, on the last night, the prince knows that she is going to flee, and so he spreads pitch upon the stairs, which is why she has to leave her shoes behind. Well, once again, the prince has to use the shoe. Again, he tracks Cinderella down to her house. And once again, the stepmother tries to intervene and make sure one of her daughters marries the prince. However, the slipper doesn't fit, and unlike in the Disney movies, the stepmother decides to force it by cutting off one of her daughter's toes. Well, when the prince notices that the new bride of his has a bleeding foot, he knows that there must have been a mistake. He goes back, and the stepmother tries the same trick again, but this time she cuts off a piece of her other daughter's heels. Once again, the prince notices the deception and returns to the house, and he finds Cinderella. There's a little epilogue to the story, however, and we see that Cinderella and the prince get married, and the stepsisters try to attend. However, when they get close to where the ceremony is happening, Cinderella's bird friends swoop down on them, and 2 pigeons pluck out an eye from each of them and blind the stepsisters. And that is the Grimm version of the tale. If any of that sounds familiar to you, and it's not because you've read the Grimm version of the story, it might be because Disney kind of adapted this one as well when they made their live-action adaptation of Stephen Sondheim's musical, Into the Woods. Into the Woods follows the Cinderella story as told in the Grimm brothers much more closely than it does the Perrault version. There are some interesting little Easter eggs and connections you can find by reading the literary versions of Cinderella. For example, mice, which are barely mentioned in Perrault's version, but those mice were the inspiration for the Disney characters Jacques and Gus Gus and all the other mice characters that sing and dance and participate in the Disney animated story. Kenneth Branagh, when he made the live-action Cinderella for Disney, also took the lizards from that story and made them the footmen, something that was absent in the original animated film. There aren't as many connections to be found between the Disney films and the Grimm version of the story, however, there are a few. For example, in the Grimm version, Cinderella is friends with the birds, and that was something that was adapted into the animated film, and the birds are the ones who help the mice to create the dress that she tries to wear to the ball. Also, in the live-action film, Kenneth Branagh brought in the admonition from Cinderella's mother.
Have courage and be kind, my darling. Will you promise me? I promise.
Well, that's very similar to the advice Cinderella receives from her mother at the beginning of the Grimm story. Also in the live-action version, we have Cinderella ask her father,
Bring me the first branch your shoulder brushes on your journey.
Something that is later returned to her in the film and was returned to her in the Grimm version of the story. So we can tell by reading the Grimm version that Kenneth Branagh studied both of the original source materials, or his screenwriters did at least, and they brought in some of the key material from that story that would assist in expanding the live-action film to a feature-length, fleshed-out story. So, those are all of the things that I found reading Perrault and Grimm Brothers versions of Cinderella. In the comments, please let me know if any of this information was new to you and what you learned today. Also, let me know which version of the story you like the best. I personally favor the Perrault version of the 2 literary tales, but maybe that's just because I grew up watching the Cinderella animated movie. Please let me know what story you would like me to compare with its Disney film version next, Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.